'cause I am a pirate. Skirting the seven seas with my mateys. Newcastle are really good now. They're the real deal, perhaps. And me and Jon Mackenzie are going to talk about how good Newcastle are and why they're good and how they're doing it. Because by God, they're good now.
I want to talk about their out of possession stuff,
Yes,
JJ.
I thought you'd say that. Perhaps mostly because you said it to me a second ago before we started this, but also because you like that. Will we just do briefly what they'd look like in possession so people know?
We can do, yeah.
It's a 4-3-3 basically, just like that. They play a 4-3-3, they're really intense, very energetic, very direct. They've got really clever structures for playing the ball through, which we'll discuss in a bit. But it's generally that sort of basic thing. But the way they do it is very good. But how about out of possession stuff, which you noticed was particularly impressive against Arsenal, correct?
Exactly, yeah. So,
Yes.
yeah, very aggressive, intense pressing side, and they cause lots of teams lots of problems, not only because of the intensity of what they're doing, but, you know, the fact that they have all of these routes to make it difficult in build-up. They have ways of, you know, squeezing teams to the sideline and making it hard for them. So I've got the setup here actually in a 4-5-1 formation, because actually people think of teams like Newcastle, teams like Liverpool, and there's lots of similarities between the two, as being quite, you know, just high pressing, aggressive intensity all the time. But actually Newcastle often operate out of this sort of 4-5-1 shape.
Yes.
They can be quite passive in certain situations, and they're only going to jump forward and be really aggressive on certain triggers. So you'll often see them allowing the opposition to play the ball around the back. But there's going to be certain triggers where once the ball is moving in a certain way or the players are set up a certain way, that's going to trigger their intense pressing.
Does it change per team? So like you might have the trigger would be Ben White or something in this game or something like that.
Sure, yeah. I think that obviously each game was going to have its own sort of bespoke pressing approach. But I think one of the things that Newcastle are really looking for is the ball moving backwards. So they're quite happy to be, you know, fairly passive in this kind of situation. But what they want to start doing is jumping when that ball starts moving back. That's going to be a trigger for them to move as a unit. And you'll often see this happening where, you know, ball has moved around, it'll go all the way around the field, and then suddenly you'll end up with this situation where, you know, everyone is marked up. There's very little space to move.
Yeah.
The midfield are really, really aggressive getting forward, and you go from that situation where you feel as though you're in control of possession of the ball to actually we've made a couple of backwards passes and suddenly Newcastle have squeezed us into a corner, and it becomes very hard to break down from there.
Right, so they sort of let them play out a little bit so they can move up the pitch a bit more to leave a bit of space and then they pounce. That's
I think it's because it's such an aggressive way of pressing that if you press from the off straight away, then you're always going to be in these sorts of situations where, you know, you're leaving yourself exposed at the back. So they're going to be very careful about there's certain situations where they are happy to go aggressive, and if the ball is moving backwards, obviously it's going to be much harder for the opposition to actually profit from those scenarios.
John, how should Arsenal be trying to beat a team like Newcastle?
Yeah, so I think the big question is then trying to find out where the weaknesses are going to exist in their pressing traps and their pressing approach,
right,
to try and be able to exploit them. And I think there's a few different scenarios where you can actually end up doing that. So, as we've already said, there's going to be moments where they're able to jump high, where they're going to jump high and go really aggressive. And sometimes I think there's a tendency for Newcastle, if these jumps aren't timed correctly, to open up space in the middle of the field. So this area can open up if the forward line gets forward quite aggressively. And so the big question is, can you generate scenarios where this kind of thing is happening? So I've got a couple of screenshots just to show what this looks like. So this is in the 18th minute of the game, and I've drawn on the lines to show the front three and then the midfield three as well.
Yes.
Now, often what Newcastle...
Well, I see one of them's lying down. Is this part of the tactics, John?
Yeah, this is not good. This is not good.
This is what Eddie Howe's doing that's making him better than the other managers.
That's right, yeah. He's going to have a word.
Can he move while he's on the ground like that?
This is Miguel Almiron. I think he's going to have a word with him afterwards and say, if you stand up here, it's probably a bit
But can
better.
he like fly around the pitch on his tummy like that? Like,
no, that's only on computer games where there's
You're
a
not
glitch.
allowed to do that?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
But I've drawn this up just to show that in these sorts of situations, what's happened is the front line have jumped forward, and what's ended up happening is you've ended up with a big space in between. This is the midfield three. You've got Dan Burn here as well, who's jumped forward to track one of the runners.
Right.
But actually the ball pops out, Declan Rice gets the ball, and he's actually able to get right the way down the field and play the ball off sideways. So what you can do if you're playing a team like Newcastle is try and manipulate them into these sorts of situations. I've got another one here. Again, there's your front three. Because Newcastle have squeezed onto this side to try and make it hard for Arsenal to build
They
up.
jumped on the left side here, and that's why there's a bit of a the 4-3-3
Yeah.
is a bit different, so,
So
then there's room to...
Yeah, so the ball's actually, I mean, in the first one,
Yeah.
the ball naturally ended up there just because it bundled out and there was gaps, and Rice picked the ball up and was able to carry it. And again, here, what they've done is they've squeezed onto this side of the pitch, and the pitch has opened here, and Rice has been able to have it and get forward. So that's one way, I think, of being able to manipulate this Newcastle team. If you can get the ball to players in between the two lines when they're stretched in those high pressing moments. But there's going to be other situations as well, because obviously the pressing situation isn't always going to be the case that you're jumping into that pressing moment, as we said, out of the 4-5-1. There's going to be situations where sometimes Arsenal are going to have a goal kick, and that's going to change things a little bit as well. Okay, so when Arsenal are taking a goal kick, often what you'll see is Newcastle lining their front three up really narrow into this kind of area, with the idea being that because you're already high up the pitch, if the ball comes out this way, then you can try and do that jump, squeeze them into the corner, and you're able to be aggressive in
That's
these
what
moments.
I recognise, yeah.
Now, the problem is that they also have quite a narrow midfield as well, covering the midfielders of the opposition, but also they tend to, because their front three is so narrow, they tend to leave these wide players free. And so the player who's responsible for covering them is the outside centre midfielder. So if you play the ball quickly into this kind of area, you can get these scenarios where you're able to sort of overload in these wide areas. The rest of the midfielders come across, and then you'll see Guimaraes and Longstaff on this side moving across as well. And so again, you've got that situation that we've talked about where, because you're trying to compress space, compact space, you are going to leave areas unattended elsewhere on the field. And so what you can do from these sorts of situations is move the ball between these three, and then if you can try and move the ball into that space, then the idea should be that you now have an overload, you're running at the back line, and you've pulled all the midfielders across.
Right, and so I guess really good teams are able to get out of that press sometimes, but Newcastle execute it very well, which is how they're stopping teams be able to play out against them and creating their own chances in that part of the pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything in football tactically is about trade-offs. If you're going to be a really aggressive pressing team, it means you're going to get compact, which means you're going to be leaving space on the other side. So I just wanted to show you a few examples of how you can actually manipulate the press in that way. Actually, this is a build-up situation, so it's not actually from a goal kick, but what's happened is that Newcastle have forced Arsenal back this way, Arsenal attacking this way down the field. And what's going to happen is the ball's going to end up back at the goalkeeper, and you can see the Newcastle players are going to squeeze onto the other side of the field. So here's Raya on the ball. There's Wilson, who's the striker. Here's Gordon, as we've said, they're really narrow to make sure they block out the pitch. And here's Ben White, who's the fullback. So that when the ball is played to Ben White, it's Joe Linton, who's playing as the outside centre midfielder, who's coming across and closing him down. Now, Ben White is going to have access into the wide player, so Saka is going to drop in, and that's all, you're already starting to think about how do we work these triangles where we can move the ball through that and then switch to the other side. So ball comes in immediately to actually it's Havertz in this situation. He's dropped out wide. He's going to play a first-time pass into this space here, and Martinelli, weirdly, is on this side of the field at this point in time. And again, what he's going to do is going to receive the ball, take it down, and as we said now, we've got all of the Newcastle players squeezed up on this side of the pitch.
Yeah.
And so you've got an easy pass now into Rice into that space that's opened out, and that you just need to find that pass, and then you're running, essentially at the back line. Actually, in this situation, Arsenal mess up, but this is one of the very few moments where they were actually able to do that against Newcastle. They weren't trying to exploit that wide weakness that they have.
So I'm guessing it's not just Arsenal that are trying to come up with ways to get through the Newcastle press, right? Because they've beaten a lot of teams, but a lot of teams will have studied exactly how to get through them.
Yeah, and I think that's the big story with Newcastle, is how do you manipulate their press to create those spaces that you can then exploit. And I don't think Arsenal did a good enough job against Newcastle of being able to exploit those, which is why they created very little chances in the game. But I think the gold standard so far this season has been the Man City game against Newcastle in the league. Obviously, they lost in the cup, but I think there's maybe caveats for why that was the case. But Man City had a really interesting way of playing up against Newcastle. So let's go back to what we were talking about before from a goal kick, where we see Newcastle get really narrow, like this. Man City nominally
Who's lying down here?
Yeah, Almiron's lying down.
Okay.
But in these situations, we've got a back four, we've got a 4-2-4 shape. So I think we've got Rodri here and Kovacic here as the two midfielders. And then you have Akanji, Ake, and I think we've got Gvardiol here and Walker here. Now, in this situation, because this front line is going to be quite narrow, you actually don't need to worry too much about having the width in these kinds of areas necessarily. So what we saw from Pep Guardiola was two really interesting things. One was pushing Walker right up the field into this kind of area here. Now, the reason why he's doing that, in part, is to cause problems for the shape that Newcastle are using. But what the idea here is, because you've got Foden in the wide area, and you've got also Walker here, you're overloading on Dan Burn, because everyone else has a player that they're responsible for.
So you've not only got a 5v4, you've also got 2 specifically next to Dan Burn.
Yeah, that's right. So in order to actually make the most of this overload that you've got here, what you need to do is make sure that the midfield is being occupied. So what he did is he actually pushed Akanji into the midfield line alongside Rodri and Kovacic. So now you've got Guardiola here and Diaz here. Right. I mean, it seems extremely risky, right, when you're building up.
It does.
But the idea is that if you push Akanji into the midfield, now you're forcing all of these midfielders to have to step up. So you're creating space now in between the 2 lines. And we talked already before about how, because Newcastle are an aggressive pressing team, there can be a tendency for them to introduce lines between the space in between the lines of their various pressing units.
Yeah, okay.
So you're in this situation now, and we have this scenario where we've got Walker here and Foden here, and Dan Burn, broadly speaking, responsible for the 2 of them. Now, what Manchester City were doing is they were posing a problem for Dan Burn. They were saying, we're going to move Foden into this space that we've opened up by pulling the midfield high. There's now space in between the lines. We can move Foden inside into this space, and you have an option now. Do you stay with Walker, who's pushed up, or do you follow Foden in? If you follow Foden in, you're just going to have this channel ball being played by the goalkeeper.
Right.
If you stay with him, you now have Foden in between the lines, and you're going to find ways of being able to, I mean, there's any number of different ways that they can find that free player as well. And this is just a way that you can see that Pep has understood the way that the areas where there's weakness is going to open out in this Newcastle structure, and he just poses these problems for them. How do you deal with that? Look, Dan Burn, you might argue, is like the weakest player in terms of
he's very strong though.
Transitional speed back, right? So again, what you're wanting to do is say, okay, let's move them out of the way, and then one way or the other, we're going to have someone to aim at in terms of where we're going to try and get the ball.
I like it. Should we look at how good Newcastle are statistically? Because we've got some stats, if I can use this thing, that show us how good they actually are. And how these things are all like. So teams are working out ways to play through them, but Newcastle are still getting results against a lot of them. And what we now see from Newcastle is that they have scored the most open play goals so far in the Premier League. That's good. Look at the numbers. They're second for expected goals and expected goal difference. Only Liverpool have got more, which seems to be mostly from set plays or something like that. So they've created more chances to score basically than Manchester City, which obviously shows they're doing something right. And they've also scored the most goals by forwards. So Eddie Howe is getting like central forwards in, so that narrowness is sort of showing it. Like Anthony Gordon's playing a lot like a centre forward at times. So we know it's like the 4-5-1, 4-3-3, but as we know, they get really narrow and tight, these forwards come in here. Now on the right-hand side, Almiron comes off the wing to come inside because Trippier comes forward, and he's created, I think, more chances than any Newcastle player. In fact, he's one of the most chance-creating players in open play in the whole league.
And I think they have quite a bit of flexibility, right? Because you can, if you're playing against a team where you're expecting to have the ball a lot, you want to get Trippier into these sorts of areas to be able to sling crosses in, right? Everything can sort of move around so that it fits quite nicely. But if, say, you're playing against a team who you're going to maybe struggle to build up against a little bit more, then you can do the same thing with Dan Burn pushing forward, have the other 3 move across, and then you can aim for Dan Burn and then look for second balls as well, which I think has been really dangerous for them as well. So they've got lots of flexibility in terms of like different tactical options for what they want to do in different situations.
Yeah, for sure. I think when Trippier goes forward, the thing we notice quite a lot, especially in the game of the weekend or the last few games, is they do that 3 here, like you say, when he pushes forward. He has the 2 midfielders and they drop out either side. It could be the other way up as well, but there's one player in a different vertical line like that. So what they'll do is they'll get the ball to, say, Joe Linton, something like that. But then the way they get the wingers in play is quite cool because Gordon will be wide. This is what Arsenal do as well with Saka and Martinelli, is that rather than receiving the ball, say they get the ball to Gordon here in wide areas, often the fullback will be tight to him. So then he's got no other option but to just pass back or go this way. But instead what they do is they wait for Gordon to make the run inside, and often what will happen, this will be triggered because Joe Linton will go out wide. So you've got players who are multi-positional as well. Like Joe Linton can play as a left forward and a centre forward. Gordon's exactly the same thing. So then Gordon becomes basically another striker with Wilson and Almiron as well, because you've got your 5 like this, but they keep the same front 5 in positions, but with interchanging it and then making sure they receive the balls in the right areas, which means they're just able to flow constantly forward. Oh, well, you're telling me about the lateral passing as well.
Yeah, and I think this is, again, coming back to the out of possession stuff, when you're playing against a team like Arsenal, they're going to be doing the same sort of thing, right? Where they're going to try and force you onto the side of the pitch, and everyone's going to overload on this side, and that means that you are allowing that weakness to exist on the other side of the field.
Right.
Sorry, terrible line drawing. And what I think Newcastle are really good at is actually just moving the ball really quickly, very laterally. So you get these series of
laterally means across the pitch,
across the pitch, yeah,
not up the pitch. Right?
Exactly, yeah. So you'll often see them just play these very quick series of passes across, and it may be the case now that Almiron is in a scenario where now he can make that really aggressive run towards the goal, but with a few quick passes through a pressing team's narrow, they split the pitch in half. They're trying to keep you in that side of the field. If you can play really quickly through these sorts of chains of passes, you can end up with these dangerous scenarios as well, which is, I think, something that we often see Newcastle trying to do. So often the ball will end up in this kind of area. They're going to try and get there as quickly as possible, but it may be the case that it's taken them a little while to actually get the ball to Almiron, and the opposition have been able to defend back. But often you'll then see Newcastle trying to go the other way, right? So Almiron, you'll have the option of going wide into Trippier, but you'll often see them coming back into these kind of areas as well. Guimaraes can sit at the edge of the box, take shots.
He's magic there, yeah.
A lot of it is just to do with, it's just moving the ball quickly, changing the lane that you're in so that you're constantly shuffling the defence one way or the other, and you're always looking for these sorts of areas in the wide areas to get the ball back across when you've got dangerous forwards like Isak and Callum Wilson. And then you've got really physical players as well, like Joel Linton, Joe Willock as well, Sean Longstaff. These are big guys who you can get the ball into the back post, they can head it back across the goal. So I just think it's like really direct play, and it's designed to shift oppositions side to side, create space to attack and go really direct. And I think it's good to watch, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really good to watch. And I guess like the secret to it is that what he's done is got a bunch of really good attacker, like goal scorers in the box. It's almost as if that's how you score goals. And then just like, so Gordon is basically a forward, centre forward and a winger at the same time. You've got Joe Linton, who's a midfielder and also a bit of a forward. You've got Wilson, Isak comes on the pitch, obviously. Almiron basically plays as an inside forward. So they get loads of goal scoring chances, and they've got late runs into the box from players like Longstaff and Tonali. So getting all the goals. Then they follow up with the excellent out of possession stuff. And that's how they've managed to beat PSG 4-1. That's quite impressive. Beat Man City in the Cup. Like, that's pretty good as well. They're hard to beat in the Cups. They beat Arsenal 1-0 yesterday, which was a fun game. And then they destroyed Man United 3-0 during the week, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think, we talked a little bit about how the similarities between where they're at now and where Liverpool were at early on with Jurgen Klopp.
Yeah.
And I think, there's a real sense in which this style can be very effective. It can, the intensity, the directness, if you get it right, then you can cause teams a lot of problem. I guess the questions in the future will always be what happens when teams just start digging in.
And when you lose momentum, because then that's the thing that I found with the old Klopp Liverpool, is that when they lost momentum, they weren't quite as powerful, but it also, when they weren't playing well, they managed to get through. I guess the other point that's good about it is that you can take players out, like through injury or suspension or rotation, and drop them in, and then the system still does the same thing. And then intensity will often get you through it. Like the physicality, they're really strong, fast, they're powerful, this is the thing. And then you look at, certain, like Man United, who they beat 3-0, you can see the difference in physicality and athleticism was a huge part of what they're playing. But then the clever technical parts and tactical parts are what's making them so good. So I suppose we should finish the video by asking, are they the real deal?
I think so. I think the big question is going to be creativity, right? So you look at that midfield, and it's similar to, you remember early Jurgen Klopp when people are looking at that midfield and seeing like James Milner and Jordan
How
Henderson.
Sean Longstaff something good?
Yeah, exactly. So you've got Longstaff. Obviously, Guimaraes is an incredible player.
I like Sean Longstaff.
I like all three of them, but they're in terms of technical creativity, they're not the sorts of players that you expect to see in a Premier League midfield. And the big question with Liverpool was always like, where is their creativity coming from? They got it through their fullbacks, obviously. Newcastle are doing a similar thing, but with Liverpool, it was always constantly like you have a really aggressive, hyper-physical midfield who are, you need to have them because of your pressing. It does limit where you can get your creativity in the team as well. And I think that's going to be the question that will eventually come to haunt Newcastle.
Haunt
is not the right word.
No, like a friendly ghost.
Yes, it's more of this is going to become an issue at some point. How are you going to go about solving it?
But I think Eddie Howe will find a way.
Yes, sure.
Yes. Who are you going to call? Eddie Howe.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.